What is democracy and why do we need it? Spoiler alert, it's not exactly the system that we currently have here in the US. Hey, I'm Ahsante, and here's what I've been thinking. In a democracy, the government is us, and you can't have freedom without democracy. Democracy is political equality. There are no kings. No one is above the law. We all have equal treatment under the law. We all have equal rights. There is no person who deserves to be a king over and above everyone else. And there's no dictator that's acceptable, because even though a dictator might seem to be benevolent, at any moment they could decide to abuse your rights, abuse their authority, become corrupt. So in a democracy, rather than power to one person or even one group of people like an aristocracy, it's power to the people. That way we all have a say and we all have some sort of control over the rules that govern our lives. But that begs the question, if that's what a democracy is, then do we really have one? It certainly feels like a lot of the rules that are controlling our lives are not things that we've had a direct say in. It feels like our representatives don't really represent us, and it certainly feels like there's a lot of power concentrated in the hands of a few. So is the United States a democracy? Well, my answer is yes and no. Democracy is both an ideal, but it's also a spectrum, and I will be drawing that spectrum out in a bit, but essentially, the US has gotten more democratic over time. We haven't reached that ideal of democracy, but along the spectrum of democracy, we have been steadily moving towards the democratic side. The story of America is the story of progressive freedom struggle. We have gotten more and more free and more democratic over time. We did technically have a pre-democratic constitution at the nation's inception, but even within that constitution, we were a republic that was supposed to be a representative republic, where those leaders represented the will of the people. This country was still founded on the consent of the governed and on the idea that there are no more kings. The founders obviously didn't have a fully democratic vision. They did allow for slavery after all. You do also have to acknowledge that wanting no more kings to rule over you was completely radical at the time, and it was a step towards democratizing. The ideals that the founders put forth in the Declaration of Independence about humans being created as equals and having individual rights and government only being just if it has the consent of the governed, those are democratic ideals. The execution in the Constitution was not as democratic. The founders had a valid concern. Again, credit where credit is due. If we're not going to have a king that has been trained and prepared for this sort of leadership role, we do need to have virtuous leaders who are responsible, who know what they're doing, and we can't necessarily trust just anyone. We also want power to be in good hands. We need the leaders to be responsible. And the founders were thinking that the government needed to be run by virtuous people. That's the valid concern. The mistake they made was thinking that the only virtuous people were rich white men. Now that matched the thinking at the time, but we now know and have the science that shows that men are not inherently more rational or less emotional than women are. We also know that there's no biological basis to race. There's no virtue or inherent inferiority along racial categories. And as far as wealth signaling virtue, well, rich people are just as capable as the rest of us of making terrible judgment calls. Virtue doesn't map cleanly onto these race, gender, and class categories, but we do need to have widespread public virtue in order for democracy to work. So over time, that has led to more inclusion, things like public education, things like social welfare, so that everyone does have some level of resources so that they're not only thinking in survival mode. Those are the things that are necessary to have a well-functioning democracy. So are we all the way over to the ideal of total political equality? No. While American democracy today is far from perfect, it's important to be able to see the progress, and it's also important not to say that, well, we don't have a perfect system, therefore none of this matters, and it's important that we don't let ourselves go backwards. We have one of our political parties openly advocating for the extreme concentration of power into the hands of a few. We have one of the vice presidential candidates listening to thinkers that actually support monarchy. The founders of this country, flawed though they were, knew that monarchy was not compatible with liberty and justice for all. The idea that we should be ruled by one man and not ruled by the rule of law is un-American. Again, that was the entire founding premise of this country, is that we're not doing kings no more. Sorry, boo. George Washington, our mythic hero, stepped down from office voluntarily and was like, I'm not going to be a king. I meant that, okay? We don't do kings. Period. So if that's not where we want to be, if we don't want to go backwards to pre-American times, then where do we want to be going? Well, this is the part where we really need to map out that full spectrum of democracy to see what the ideal actually would look like. So let's get into this diagram. So on one side is that ideal of a perfect democracy. Ideals are not meant to be perfectly achievable, but they do point us in the right direction. So this ideal is democracy, power to all the people, because again, we're not doing one group getting to dominate all other groups. We have political equality. So all these mean that power is shared equally. On the other hand, you have autocracy. That's power to one person. This is political inequality, and power is hoarded. Now, there's a temptation to view this as a binary, and if you were to split it down the middle, say to yourself, well, if we're more to the democratic side, that means we're a democracy, and either you're a democracy or you're not. That's it. But that is where the confusion happens. That's how we get to be a democracy that doesn't actually feel very democratic. So in my conception of this, and these are, just my thoughts, there's actually a middle ground where no, we're not to the most extremes of autocracy, but we're not really to democracy either. There's this middle area that we need to account for. Oh, I love coloring, I will say. So when you think about us having this middle ground, it becomes a little more clear. One thing that can be a bit confusing is that this middle ground tends to have universal voting. And because universal voting, everyone having the right to vote, is the most basic element of democracy, we tend to call anything with universal voting a democracy. So this entire area winds up being so-called democracy. Even when there's still a lot of elite control of politics, even when there's so much money in politics so that we don't all have our voices heard, the voices of the rich count way more than the voices of those of us who are not rich. All of it can be put into the label of democracy, which can make us seem like, well, this is how it's supposed to be. This is the democratic state. Nothing for us to do is what it is. But we haven't gotten to the blue. This is the area that I'm calling a congruent democracy. Now, this is my term, so don't be looking this up because you ain't gonna find it. Coining this, if you will. Don't go Googling like congruent democracy. I've never heard of that. I know. Listen, stay with me, stay with me. A congruent democracy is a democracy where the structures of power and the structures of government actually match those ideals, the ideals that are currently in our Declaration of Independence. It's an area where we actually do have power to all people. We are practicing political equality, and we do have a system where power is shared relatively equally. Again, we never get to total perfection, but honestly, anywhere close, much closer to this would be great. So how do we get there? Let's map out what's on this spectrum specifically.